What if the most powerful gods in history went to war? Not legends, not stories, but a real clash between the gods of Greece and Egypt. Zeus, the ruler of the sky, against Ra, the god of the sun itself. If these two pantheons collided, who would actually survive? Before the first bolt was thrown, before the first ray of divine fire scorched the heavens, there was silence. A silence so deep it stretched across two worlds, across the wine-dark seas of Greece and the golden, endless sands of Egypt. Two civilizations, two cosmologies, two visions of creation itself. And at the crown of each sat a god unlike any other. One ruled from a mountain wreathed in cloud and thunder. The other sailed the sky in a vessel of burning light. For ages uncounted, they had never met. But the cosmos is not infinite in its patience, and some collisions are written into the fabric of existence long before they occur. The Greeks knew their gods as vivid, passionate, terrifyingly alive, beings who loved and raged and schemed with the full intensity of divine purpose. Zeus had not been born to his throne. He had fought for it, bled for it, torn it from the iron grip of his father Kronos after a war that shook the foundations of the universe. The Titanomachy, 10 years of catastrophic war between the Titans and the Olympians, had left the cosmos cracked and trembling. When it ended, Zeus stood supreme. He divided the world with his brothers. Poseidon claimed the seas, Hades claimed the underworld, and Zeus claimed the sky and the earth above. He was not merely a king. He was the enforcer of cosmic order, the keeper of oaths, the one being whose wrath could unmake the plans of gods and men alike. Egyptians knew their gods differently, as forces woven into the very substance of reality. Ra was not simply powerful. Ra was the reason the world existed at all. Each dawn he rose in his solar bark, the Manjet, sailing across the sky as the source of all warmth, all life, all divine authority. And each night he descended into the Duat, the terrifying Egyptian underworld, where he battled the chaos serpent Apophis in a war that repeated itself every single night without fail. Ra did not just rule, Ra sustained. Without him, the sun would not rise. Without him, Egypt, and perhaps all of creation, would dissolve back into the primordial darkness from which he had first emerged. Two gods, two kinds of supremacy, and a universe too small to contain both without consequence. The first sign that something had shifted came not on Earth, but in the space between realms, that vast, unmapped threshold where the Greek divine and the Egyptian divine had always maintained an uneasy, unspoken distance. Ancient sources, whispered in the temples of Alexandria, where Greek and Egyptian knowledge once merged in candlelit rooms, speak of a moment when the borders began to blur. When Greek sailors began hearing prayers answered not by Poseidon, but by something older, something that smelled of papyrus and desert wind. When the Egyptian priests noticed that their offerings to Ra were met not by his golden radiance, but by the scent of ozone and the distant rumble of thunder. Something was encroaching, something was moving across the boundary. And both gods noticed at exactly the same moment. Zeus convened the Olympians on the summit of Olympus itself, where the clouds churned perpetually and the air tasted of lightning. He stood at the center of that divine assembly, broad-shouldered, radiant with authority, his eyes the color of storm clouds before they break. Around him stood the 12, Hera with her crown of gold, Athena in her gleaming aegis, Ares with that barely contained hunger for conflict burning in his chest, Poseidon leaning on his trident like a man who has walked across the bottom of the sea and owns every grain of sand there. Apollo stood beside Artemis, two faces of the same divine light. Hermes watched with clever, restless eyes, and the others, Hephaestus, Aphrodite, Demeter, Dionysus, waited, sensing the gravity of the moment. Zeus spoke without preamble. There was a power rising from the south and east, a divine order whose authority overlapped with his own. He had felt it the way a king feels a rival's army crossing into his territory, not through messengers, but through the marrow of his bones. The Olympians would not yield. The world had an order, and that order flowed through Olympus. Whatever these southern gods believed, they would learn the truth. Ares smiled for the first time in decades. But if you think Ares' eagerness was the most dangerous thing in that room, you have not been paying attention. Because across the desert, in the golden halls of the Egyptian divine court, something far more deliberate was already being set in motion. Ra had called his own council, and Ra's council was nothing like Olympus. Where the Olympians were passionate, volcanic, driven by personality and pride, the Egyptian gods operated with the slow, inexorable precision of the Nile itself. Ra sat in his solar throne, ancient beyond reckoning, his body radiating heat that could blister stone, his eyes two discs of pure solar fire. Around him, the assembled gods of the Egyptian pantheon reflected the full spectrum of divine function. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and writing, stood with a reed pen already moving across papyrus, recording what had not yet occurred but soon would. Horus, the falcon-headed sky god, stood with his wings half spread, his one divine eye blazing with righteous fury. He had already seen, through that eye, what was coming. Anubis stood in the shadows as he always did, his jackal head tilted slightly, weighing something invisible in his hands. Set, god of chaos, storms of the desert, the red fury of the storm, stood apart from the others, and even the other Egyptian gods did not stand too close to Set when his power was roused. And then there was Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of war and destruction, whose breath could scorch the air and whose anger was said to be one of the few things Ra himself feared. She said nothing during the council. She simply watched the horizon with burning golden eyes, and that was enough to make the assembled gods speak more carefully than they might have otherwise. Ra listened to them all, then he spoke, and when Ra spoke in council, it was not with the thundering, immediate authority of Zeus. It was something quieter and more absolute, like the first light of dawn, undeniable, inevitable. He told them that the Greek gods had breached the boundary between pantheons, whether intentionally or through the careless expansion of their divine influence. He told them that the question was not whether to respond, but how to respond with the precision that divine order required. And he told them something that made even Thoth pause mid-inscription. He intended to handle this himself, in part. Ra, who had not left the cycle of the sky and the duat in longer than Egyptian priests could calculate, was going to enter the conflict directly. The temperature in the hall rose by several degrees. And somewhere between those two councils, in the sacred space where divine decisions harden into cosmic reality, the war began. It did not begin with Zeus and Ra. That would come, but not yet. The first blood, so to speak, was divine in a more diffuse way. It was a collision of lesser powers, a border skirmish in the heavens that nevertheless sent shockwaves through both pantheons. Ares, never one to wait for orders he agreed with in principle, moved first. He crossed into the frontier between realms with his twin sons Deimos and Phobos, fear and dread, trailing behind him like a storm of psychological annihilation. Ares was not subtle. He was not designed for subtlety. He moved through the mythic borderlands with the force of a siege weapon, his red armor blazing, his spear already leveled. He fully expected to encounter something he could break. What he encountered, instead, was Set. If Ares was the god of war as it feels from inside the battle, the rage, the chaos, the blood-soaked immediacy of it, then Set was something adjacent and perhaps more terrifying. Set was the god of chaos, yes, but chaos as a cosmic principle. He had murdered his own brother Cyrus and dismembered him across the world. He had fought Horus in a war that lasted 80 years and shook the Egyptian cosmos to its roots. He was not afraid of Ares. He was, if anything, interested. The clash between Ares and Set was the kind of conflict that leaves marks on the landscape of myth itself. The air between them turned the color of old blood. Deimos and Phobos circled like vultures, projecting waves of fear, but Set laughed, because chaos does not fear itself. He drove his scepter into the ground, and the desert itself responded, erupting in storms of red sand that scoured divine flesh like 1,000 blades. Ares answered with the pure kinetic fury of war incarnate, pressing forward through the storm with a force that would have driven any lesser being backward into the earth. They were, if we are being precise, evenly matched, and that was the first sign that this war would not be simple. Meanwhile, at sea, because Poseidon was not a god who waited for invitation, the god of the oceans had surged east, his trident cracking open fissures in the seabed, raising walls of water that blotted out the horizon. He had heard of the Egyptian concept of Nun, the primordial ocean, the dark water that existed before creation. Poseidon considered himself the lord of all oceans, including ones in other people's cosmologies. This was, in retrospect, a significant miscalculation. Because none was not a god you could challenge with a trident. None was not a god at all, in the way Poseidon understood godhood. None was the primordial deep, the water from which Ra himself had first emerged at the dawn of creation. When Poseidon drove his power into those eastern waters, he felt something push back that had no name, no face, no ego. Just a weight of absolute primordial existence that made the god of the Mediterranean seas feel, for the first time, genuinely small. He pulled back, not in defeat. Poseidon was far too proud for that, but in the caution of someone who has touched a wall and realized the wall extends forever in every direction. If this disturbed him, he kept it to himself, but he sent word to Olympus. These gods were not what they had expected. And this is where the story becomes something more than a war, because Athena was watching all of this, watching Ares and Set grind each other into cosmic stalemate, watching Poseidon recoil from something older than the sea, watching the front lines of this divine conflict begin to reveal uncomfortable truths about the nature of each pantheon's power. Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare, had not drawn a weapon yet. She was thinking, and when Athena thought, civilizations trembled. She brought her conclusions to Zeus, and what she told him changed everything. The Egyptian gods, she said, were not simply powerful, they were structurally different. The Greek gods drew their power from worship, yes, from the belief and sacrifice of mortals, but they were also fundamentally individual. Each Olympian was a distinct personality, a sovereign divine entity with their own will and agenda. Their strength was personal. Their authority was hierarchical, with Zeus at the apex, but each god was essentially their own being. The Egyptian gods, Athena had observed, operated more like a unified cosmic system. They were not just worshipped, they were the mechanisms of creation itself. Ra did not merely rule the sun. Ra was the sun's ability to rise. Thoth was not just associated with wisdom and writing, he was the principle by which language gave structure to reality. Anubis was not simply a guide of the dead, he was the process by which death was given meaning and order. They were, in a sense, less like individuals and more like living laws of the universe. This meant, Athena concluded with a gravity that silenced even Zeus for a long moment, that you could not simply defeat them the way you defeat an opponent in battle. You could not break Set the way you could break a warrior. You could not overpower Thoth the way you could overpower a rival king. The only way to truly end this war was at the top, where individual divine will still operated with full sovereignty. Zeus against Ra, sky against sun. Two kings of two orders of existence, facing each other without the machinery of their respective cosmologies to shield them. Zeus sat with this for exactly 3 seconds. Then he stood, picked up his thunderbolts, and said he would handle it personally. Of course, he did. What happened next would change everything, and it began not with a charge, but with a meeting. Because Ra, with the wisdom of an entity that had navigated the underworld every single night and emerged victorious at every single dawn, had come to the same conclusion Athena had reached. He knew that the war between the two pantheons' secondary powers was producing nothing but chaos, and Ra, unlike Set, had no love for meaningless chaos. He sent Thoth as emissary, because Thoth was the only being in all of existence who could walk between divine boundaries without being perceived as a threat. Thoth, who had invented language, who had written the names of all things into being, who could navigate the duet blind and alone. Thoth crossed the divine border, carrying a message in the oldest script known to gods. The message said, "Let the two kings meet. Let them settle this as sovereigns, not as armies. Let the war be decided where it always should have been, between those who actually bear the weight of cosmic authority." Hermes, who met Thoth at the boundary, and who felt the profound, disorienting recognition of meeting his own divine mirror, the other messenger god, the other walker between worlds, delivered the message to Zeus without a word of his own commentary, which told Zeus everything about the seriousness of what Thoth carried. Zeus accepted. The meeting place was a location that exists in no geography that mortals can visit, a plateau at the edge of the divine, where the Greek sky and the Egyptian sky pressed against each other like two great bodies of water meeting at a shoreline. There was no ground, exactly. There was only the threshold, luminous and impossible, where two cosmologies touched. Ra arrived first, ascending in his solar bark as he always did, but today the bark came not from the east horizon, but from across the divine boundary, blazing with a light that was older than the Greek concept of light. He stepped from the bark and stood on the threshold, and he was terrible and magnificent. His body blazed with the concentrated force of all solar creation. His headdress bore the disk of the sun, and it was not symbolic. It was the sun itself, focused and personal, a weapon and a crown simultaneously. His eyes were the eyes of something that had watched the cosmos be born from the inside. Zeus arrived in a different way, because Zeus did not take boats. He descended through his own storm, riding a thunderhead that he had assembled over the previous hour with the casual mastery of someone who has controlled whether the way ordinary beings control their own hands. Lightning walked around him like attendants. The wind around him moved at his emotional state, and right now, standing across the threshold from the first true equal he had ever faced, Zeus was something between furious and exhilarated. He looked at Ra the way a warrior looks at a worthy opponent, not with contempt, with recognition. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Ra spoke first, and his voice was the sound of sunrise, gradual, inevitable, the kind of thing that does not announce itself because it does not need to. He said that Zeus was powerful. He acknowledged this the way a man acknowledges a mountain, not as a compliment, but as a factual observation. He said that the Olympians were among the greatest individual divine beings in all of creation. And then he said something that Zeus had not expected. He said, "But I am not an individual." Zeus did not understand this immediately, which was, perhaps, the central difference between them. Ra was not simply a god who controlled the sun the way Zeus controlled lightning. Ra was the sun's divine essence. He was the mechanism by which light existed as a divine principle. When Ra rose each morning, it was not because Ra chose to rise. It was because Ra rising was what morning meant. He was not separate from his domain. He was his domain, made conscious and sovereign. His power did not come from will alone, it came from necessity. The cosmos needed Ra the way it needed gravity. And you cannot defeat gravity with a thunderbolt. Zeus threw his thunderbolts anyway, because Zeus. And here is the moment that ancient priests who recorded this myth always described with a kind of reverent awe, because what happened was not what anyone expected. The thunderbolts struck Ra. They struck him with the full force of Olympian divine power, bolts that had once shattered titans, that had burned mountains to glass, that carried the authority of the king of all the Greek gods. They struck Ra and they illuminated him, and in that illumination, for a fraction of a divine moment, Zeus saw what Ra truly was. He saw the solar bark sailing across the inside of the universe itself. He saw the nightly battle with Apophis, the great chaos serpent, the embodiment of non-existence, and he saw Ra win it every night without exception across an expanse of time that made the Titanomachy look like an afternoon disagreement. He saw the first moment of creation, when Ra emerged from the primordial none and spoke the first word, and existence answered. He saw what it meant to be not just a king of gods, but the living principle by which a cosmos maintains itself against the void. And Zeus, for the first time in his immortal life, felt something unfamiliar. Not fear, Zeus did not truly know fear, but awe, the awe of someone who has measured himself against something so fundamentally different in kind that victory and defeat suddenly seem like the wrong categories entirely. Ra absorbed the thunderbolts, not blocked them, absorbed them, drew their energy into himself the way the sun draws all light, and looked at Zeus with those ancient burning eyes and waited. The war had reached its moment of truth, and the answer, when it came, was not a victor's cry or a defeated god falling from the heavens. It was something stranger and more powerful. Subscribe to this channel if stories like this feel like something you've been searching for your whole life, because what happens next is the part that ancient priests almost never wrote down. Zeus lowered his thunderbolts. Not in surrender, let that be absolutely clear. Zeus did not surrender. Zeus was constitutionally incapable of surrender in the way that fire is constitutionally incapable of being wet. But he lowered his thunderbolts because something had shifted in his understanding of what he was looking at, and Zeus, for all his fury and pride, was the keeper of cosmic order. and cosmic order required him to be honest about what he was seeing. He was looking at something that could not be defeated by force because it was not sustained by force. Ra's power was not the power of will over circumstance. It was the power of necessity, and Zeus knew, with the deep, uncomfortable knowing of a true sovereign, that to continue this war would be to spend divine energy on an outcome that could never fully resolve. You could not conquer the sun. You could not occupy sunrise. You could not force the Egyptian cosmos to stop needing Ra any more than you could force the Greek sky to stop needing the concept of sky. And Ra, watching Zeus reach this conclusion with those ancient, patient eyes, felt something that he himself had not expected to feel in this confrontation: respect. Not the respect of recognizing a lesser power, the respect of recognizing a sovereign intelligence, a being who had won his throne through actual struggle, who bore the weight of all mortal devotion and divine responsibility with genuine authority. Ra had created existence, yes. But Zeus had rebuilt order from chaos with his own hands. That was a different kind of greatness. And Ra, who had infinite patience and absolute honesty, could acknowledge it. The two gods stood on the threshold between worlds, and the war, the full war, with Set and Ares locked in their furious stalemate, with Poseidon circling the eastern waters. With Anubis silently observing from the shadows and Athena calculating, and Horus watching, with his all-seeing eye, and Sekhmet straining at whatever invisible leash Ra had placed on her, all of it paused, as if the entire divine conflict was holding its breath. What they negotiated in that threshold space, the ancient myths agree on in outline, if not in every detail. The two pantheons would acknowledge each other's domains. The Greek gods would not press east into the territory where the Egyptian cosmic order maintained creation. The Egyptian gods would not push north and west into the living sea of mortal devotion and divine individuality that the Olympians called home. There would be no conquered territory because the truth that Ra had always known and Zeus now understood, was that the two cosmologies were not competing for the same thing. They were, in their deepest nature, different answers to different questions about existence. The Greeks asked, "Who has the power?" The Egyptians asked, "What is existence made of?" Both questions were real. Both answers were necessary. The war ended not with a defeat, but with a recognition. And that recognition, the ancient voices say, was more consequential than any victory could have been. But what of the central question? What of the hook that started all of this? Who would actually survive if these two great gods truly collided without limit, without restraint, without the wisdom that ultimately pulled them back from the edge? The honest answer, the mythologically grounded answer, is this: Ra would endure, not because Ra was the better warrior, not because Ra's power was greater in some measurable divine quantity, but because Ra's existence was necessary in a way that transcended contest. Zeus could be challenged. Zeus had been challenged by the Titans, by the giants, by Typhon, that monstrous final enemy who had nearly unmade Olympus entirely. Zeus had survived those challenges through strength and cunning and the loyalty of his family. But Zeus's existence, for all its glory, was contingent on the world needing a king of gods. Ra's existence was contingent on the world needing a sun, and the world needed a sun with a finality that no thunderbolt could argue with. Zeus was perhaps the greatest sovereign in the history of divine mythology, but Ra was something closer to a law of the universe wearing a crown, and laws endure longer than kings, even divine ones. What made Zeus magnificent, his personality, his individual will, his rage and his passion and his terrible personal authority, was precisely what made him vulnerable in a confrontation with something that was not a person but a principle. You can out-argue a king, you cannot out-argue sunrise. And yet, and here the myth insists on its own complexity, Zeus was not diminished by this. The Greeks understood, in their deepest theological traditions, that Zeus was not merely a powerful being. He was the embodiment of divine order as a living, choosing, sovereign force. The Egyptians understood their gods as cosmic necessities. The Greeks understood their gods as cosmic choices. And perhaps the most profound thing this myth has to offer is the suggestion that the universe needs both, the necessity of Ra and the sovereignty of Zeus, to be fully itself. The other gods disperse slowly, the way great storms disperse, not all at once, but gradually, with residual energy crackling at the edges long after the center has gone quiet. Ares and Set parted from each other with something that was not quite respect and not quite rivalry, but some divine compound of both. They would never stop being what they were, Ares the war fury, Set the chaos storm, but they had measured each other, and that measurement would echo through every conflict those two forces touched for the rest of mythological time. Poseidon retreated from the eastern waters, carrying something he would never fully explain to the other Olympians, an understanding of depth that went beyond even the ocean's floor. Anubis returned to his work of weighing souls, which had continued without interruption throughout the entire war, because death does not take time off for divine conflicts. Thoth completed his inscription of the event with the calm satisfaction of a being who had already written the outcome before it occurred, and was pleased to find reality in agreement with his records. And Horus, the falcon-eyed god who sees all distances, who watched the whole encounter from the altitude of the divine sky, is said to have turned his blazing eye toward Olympus as the Greek gods withdrew, and to have seen something there worth watching. The myth does not say what. Some things, even in the oldest stories, are preserved in silence because silence is the only container large enough to hold them. If the story of Zeus and Ra has stayed with you, if you feel the weight of these two divine orders pressing against each other in your chest, then share this with someone who needs to hear it. The ancient world kept these myths alive not because they were entertainment, but because they carried something true about the structure of existence itself. Subscribe and stay close. The next story goes somewhere even older, even stranger, and even more impossible to look away from. Zeus returned to Olympus and sat on his throne for a long time without speaking. The clouds moved around him at the speed of his thoughts, which were moving very fast indeed. He had gone to that threshold expecting to prove something. He had returned having learned something instead. And Zeus, for all his flaws, was wise enough to know the difference between those two outcomes and to understand that the second was the rarer gift. He picked up a thunderbolt and turned it in his hands. It was still bright, still powerful, still completely, absolutely his. The world still needed him, needed his justice, his sovereignty, his terrible insistence that order be maintained against the forces that would dissolve it. The encounter with Ra had not shrunk him. If anything, it had clarified him, shown him the specific and irreplaceable shape of what he was, by showing him something he was not. In the Egyptian temples along the Nile, Ra completed his solar journey that evening and descended into the duat as he did every night, to face Apophis in the darkness beneath the world. The battle was as it always was, immense, primal, the very archetype of light against oblivion, and Ra won it as he always won it, because some outcomes are written into the structure of existence itself. But the priests who watched from the temple thresholds that night noticed something they had not observed before. The light that preceded Ra's bark through the underworld was slightly different, not brighter, not stronger, but somehow more conscious, as if Ra had returned from something that had reminded him of what he was for. And in the space between two cosmologies, in that luminous threshold where Greek sky and Egyptian sky still pressed against each other like tectonic plates, Thoth and Hermes stood together in the quiet aftermath, comparing notes. Two messenger gods, two keepers of divine communication, two beings who understood that the real history of the universe was written not in battles, but in the conversations that followed them. Thoth wrote, Hermes talked. Neither was surprised to find the other worth listening to. Some say this is where the first library came from, a meeting between two divine scribes at the edge of a war that ended in understanding rather than ash. The word for it has been lost, but the feeling of it, the sense that knowledge shared across impossible distances, is the truest form of peace that has survived everything. What if the most powerful gods in history went to war? They did. And what they discovered at the end of that war was stranger and more durable than any victory, that the universe is large enough for more than one kind of truth, that Ra endures because existence needs a sun, that Zeus reigns because existence needs a sovereign will, that between necessity and choice, between cosmic law and divine personality, the world is held together by a tension that looks like conflict, but is, in its deepest nature, a balance. The war between the Greek and Egyptian gods ended. The balance between what they represent never did. And somewhere between the thunder and the sunrise, the story goes on.